Good morning, everyone. I, Thomas Kyle, call the Hybrid Construction Energy Board meeting of June 21st, 2022 to order at 9:30 a.m. Debbie, would you call the roll?
Yes, sir. From the Mechanical Board, we have Jay Hansen.
Present.
Thank you, Jay. And acting as chair for this morning from the Electrical and Elevator Board, we have Thomas Kyle.
Present.
From the Building Code Structures Board, we have Gary Heineken.
Here.
Thank you. And from the Building Code Structures Board, Eric Sandoval. Okay, I'll come back to Eric. Okay, from the Electrical and Elevator Board, we have Ryan Richards.
Here.
Thank you. From the Oregon State Department of Energy, we have Blake Shalide.
Blake is here.
Thank you, Blake. Okay, from the Mechanical Board, we have Walter Caudle.
Present.
Thank you. From the Residential and Manufactured Structures Board, we have John Camiller.
Present.
Again, from the Residential and Manufactured Structures Board, we have Eli Volume.
Present.
Thank you. And from the State Plumbing Board, Matthew Roselle is excused this morning. From the State Plumbing Board, we have Travis Argue.
Here.
Thank you, Travis. And coming back to Eric Sandoval. Eric? Okay, I'll mark him absent. If he does happen to connect, then we will need to notify the time he connects. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. You can go on with your meeting.
Okay. Just to clarify something, Debbie, and for the rest of you, with this, if you want to speak up or say something at the meeting, I know there's a way to raise your hand on the screen, but if you see him doing that, Debbie, would you yell it out? Otherwise, just speak up so that we can get the comments that we need done.
I certainly will, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Okay, Vice Chair Thomas Kyle rule that the agenda and order of business is approved. The next item on the agenda is Item I.D. It's the draft minutes. If anybody has any corrections to the draft minute. Okay, hearing none, Vice Chair Kyle ruled the draft minutes of the combined meetings of July 28th, 2021 is final. The date of the next meeting is October 18th, 2022. Okay, item 2, public comment. Ian, is there any public comment on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is actually Andy Bolton, Senior Policy Advisor with the division. I'm filling in for Ian this morning. As of this morning, we have not had requests for general public comment, and no one here in the room is signed up for public comment. I'd like to hold the line open for just a moment here in case there is anyone online who is not signed up but would like to provide general public comment to the board. If you are on the line and would like to provide general public comment, please go ahead and speak up now and state your name and who you represent. Okay. Hearing none, Mr. Chair, that concludes general public comment.
All right, thank you, Andy. Mr. Heiser, would you give us the program update for the Energy Board? It's item 3.
Thank you, Chair Kyle. Mark Heiser with the division, Mechanical and Energy Specialist. Update from the division is that we are continuing to follow the developments at ASHRAE Standard 90.1 on the main committee, trying to make sure we're keeping up with following addenda that will probably be included in the Standard 90.1 2022 book. The publication is not exactly known, but we do expect the new book to come out in this fall. And with the publication of the new book, we expect to return to the committee sometime in 2023 to give an update on that. We're also following the work of the energy codes in Washington and at the IECC on sort of the national codes. We're following both residential and commercial, sort of following along of what they're doing at their levels. Also, the 2023 Oregon Residential Specialty Code work is starting. That will be the full book, including all structural and mechanical items, and of course, Chapter 11 of the, which has the energy provisions of the residential code. Of course, there's Executive Order 1720 and the looking to meet the equivalent performance of the Zero Energy Ready Home program that was available, I believe, version 0.6. The request for proposals is intended for any part of the residential code to go out in early July. There will be the normal open proposal period. We will have posted the intended starting point for getting to the equivalent of the ZERH program. And with that, those are the main points from the division at this time. If there are any questions, I'm available to answer any from the board if needed.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Item 4, Resilient Efficiency Buildings Task Force Update. I'm not sure who's going to speak at this. Okay, Elena, thank you.
Great, thank you, Chair Kyle. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'll give Debbie a minute to get the PowerPoint up. But basically what I wanted to do today is give this group a presentation that I gave to the Resilient Efficient Buildings Task Force probably 6 weeks or so ago. As some of you may recall, in the 2021 long session, and I'm sorry, I don't think I said I'm Alana Cox, Administrator of Building Codes. In the 2021 long session, again in the short session in February, there was a bill introduced to allow local government to adopt the REACH code as a mandatory standard. In 2021, the bill did not pass. And this year, what started as a REACH code adoption bill turned into a task force bill. And that task force is the Resilient Efficient Buildings or Rebuild Task Force. It has just short of 30 members, including SEEB Chair Mr. Hansen, as well as representatives of builders, trades, utilities, environmental organizations, and others. It's co-chaired by Senator Lieber and Representative Marsh, and Senator Finley and Representative Owens also sit on the task force. Their task is to take a look at opportunities for reducing the carbon impact of new and existing buildings, as well as climate resiliency. So far, they've met 6 times, and because it is a legislative task force, you can track it and watch along on OLIS. As I see that in my notes, I must have made this presentation more than 6 weeks ago. They've been meeting about every other week. I had the presentation of making, or the pleasure to make this presentation at the first meeting of the task force, and they've since heard from several other agencies in subsequent meetings, and they've learned about approaches taken in other states, and had some discussion on some possible recommendations that have kind of spanned from some things we've heard before, some new ideas, existing buildings, and or new construction. So with that, I will just go ahead and dive in. This is pretty much exactly what I told the task force, and I thought it would be good to give this board in particular the same information so you can kind of have that context. So next slide, please. There we go. So this just lays out the plan of what I would cover in the presentation, starting with the basics of our code system, working through where we stand now, how Oregon compares to other states, and then what the future may hold. Next slide, please. And a lot of this is going to be familiar for you guys, but so the legislature showed significant foresight when it created the building code system we use today back in 1973. Our authority is to adopt a state building code to govern the construction, reconstruction, alteration, and repair of buildings. In doing that, we're to aim for maximum practicable energy conservation. We're to do it in a manner that's cost effective and takes into account the needs of all Oregonians, including in rural or remote parts of the state. I'm going to go through the code adoption process in the next set of slides. And I wanted to point out that most of this code adoption process is statutory, including the makeup and powers of the 7 boards, including this board. And ultimately, to change a code, the appropriate board has to make the finding that the added cost, if any, is necessary to the health and safety of the occupants or the public, or necessary to conserve scarce resources. I will also dig in on costs a little more in the latter part of this presentation. But the legislature over the last almost 50 years recognized that a good code needs to balance cost with our safety and efficiency needs and bring parties together to share their expertise to develop it and to provide flexibility, to be nimble, and make a code that can apply across the state so everyone has the benefit of a good, well-researched, and reasonable code. So, as you all know, Oregon's statewide building code is made up of the various specialty codes, such as plumbing, electrical, and mechanical. The most relevant codes to this discussion are the Oregon Residential Specialty Code, which governs 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhomes, and the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, which governs commercial buildings, including multifamily, schools, factories, basically anything we regulate that isn't covered by the residential code. Our goal in code adoption is to adopt those reasonable, cost-effective, efficient, and safe codes, and also to make sure they work together and make sense. Next slide, please. We generally adopt codes in a 3-year cycle in groups to help with the handoffs in the codes. Of course, you all know that the energy efficiency provisions of the commercial code are on a different process than our other codes, where we adopt the latest version of the most efficient model code, ASHRAE 90.1, early and with minimal amendments through this board. The residential and commercial codes generally have a phase-in period to allow for training and a transition before the new code becomes mandatory. And then the codes are published, which is part of why they take so long from kickoff to adoption, generally 12 to 18 months. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think this board is pretty familiar with the code adoption process. Let's go ahead and kick it to the next slide, please. So same with this one, more about the basic code adoption process here, but I did note, and we'll note again, that the division delivers mandatory code change training to every inspector and plans examiner certified to the relevant code. And this is one of the many areas where Oregon really shines. We have excellent compliance and a highly trained workforce, both in industry and in our inspectors and plans examiners. And this mandatory training component is an important part of that success. Next slide, please. So I again apologize for folks who have heard this before, but I did want to take a moment and go over the principles we use to guide our code adoption work. I hope you've all seen this before. The first principle is to take a long view. As we dive into state-to-state comparisons and our timeline later in this presentation, I hope you keep this one in mind. Point-in-time comparisons are much less telling and relevant than a broader, longer-term view. Oregon was the first state in the country to adopt a statewide energy code, and that leadership has continued in the last almost 50 years, resulting in an overall housing stock that could go toe-to-toe with any state in the country. The other thing to note about the long view is that predictability is key in code making. It's part of how we achieve that high compliance I was talking about, and it's also important to everything throughout the development system because of all the cascading impacts of the codes. The next principle is to take a coordinated approach. Part of this is our board system, which was specifically designed to bring together stakeholders important to the subject area. The legislature also gave us a process to account for public involvement and coordination. In Oregon, we don't just adopt a code, we actually carry it out. And we could not do that without builders, labor, contractors, agency partners, board members, really everyone coming together. The next principle is to focus on performance and choice. This principle really gets at both avoiding the use of the code to promote specific products or industries, but also having a practical, workable code that allows designers and customers to have choices. Oregon spearheaded the menu system for efficiency that we use in the residential code, which was later brought into the model code. And the idea is that there are multiple ways to get from A to B in terms of improving the efficiency performance of a building. And we want codes that get results and are easy to navigate and comply with, while being able to accommodate design choices and preferences. The next principle is that the code changes should be evidence-based. It's easy to want to respond to anecdotes or theories, but codes really impact people's lives and economic development. And we want to make sure that the changes we make are based on solid evidence, so that when the board finds that the cost of a change is necessary, they can do so with confidence that the change was well-researched and based on reliable evidence. The next principle is independent verification. We use the University of Oregon to check our work on residential efficiency progress, and we verify our commercial energy progress with the US Department of Energy. I'll just pause here and say that there are a lot of ways to model or forecast energy efficiency improvements, and reasonable people differ on the subject. At the heart of it, it's important to be able to use apples to apples factors and metrics to determine progress. This conversation is timely because we have rules going to hearing tomorrow to require consistent modeling and cost analysis for efficiency code proposals, so that cost and energy savings are better understood during code development. Finally, the next principle is consistency across the state. Once a model code is adopted, as I said, we have to make sure it's really carried out and that everyone has the benefit of the code across the state. We also have to make sure that the changes we put into the code will work for all Oregonians, as noted in our statutory charge. Next slide, please. So cost is an incredibly important and challenging aspect of code adoption. Just like efficiency gains, it's important that decision makers know the cost impact of decisions that are being made, but there are also many factors involved and it can be daunting. So we have the benefit of some cost analysis at the federal level. There is a pretty thorough cost review in the ASHRAE system. In the code process I outlined earlier, the Technical Code Review Committee flags the significant fiscal impacts of the code changes they recommend, including changes that will result in cost savings. Board review includes the cost finding I referenced earlier, which ultimately comes down to how much is too much. Rulemaking includes a fiscal impact statement, housing cost impact statement, small business impact statement, and all the other trappings of rulemaking. But it's also another opportunity for folks to weigh in on what the cost is and whether it's too much. Next slide, please. So I think cost of code change is one of those things that seems pretty simple. If you have to buy more insulation, you can figure out a dollar amount per square foot. The challenge is that the flexibility that is so important to give people choices means that there are a lot of ways to comply with the code and therefore infinite cost calculations. In addition, not all cost is based on buying a new thing or more of a thing. Some of the most significant costs come from changing building practices that require significant training, education, and foresight. This distinction is going to be increasingly important as we're trying to pick the harder to reach fruit, so to speak, where the low-hanging efficiency fruit, things like efficient lights, have already been picked. We're trying to continually improve on collecting detailed cost information throughout the process, but ultimately the question becomes, as I said, how much is too much? And that goes to the board when they make their cost finding, and then again to the division through the rulemaking process. Next slide, please. So why do the costs of code changes matter and who pays? I'm sure I don't have to tell you all that we have an affordable housing crisis in this state. And while code changes are only one piece of the puzzle, we know that when we raise the price of new construction, we raise the price of all housing. It's important to take into account the extent to which the utility savings born from efficiency gains offset the cost of code provisions. This is again where it's important to have a reliable understanding of what the real world efficiency gains as well as the costs are, so that the board can have confidence in finding that the added cost is necessary to conserve scarce resources. In doing that payback analysis, it's important to understand how long the ultimate user of the building will have the benefit of the code change. Envelope changes, making the building tighter with less air leakage, last longer than equipment changes, like the efficiency of a furnace or water heater. Housing is, of course, important and often top of mind in this conversation, but we do need to make sure that the changes to the code are practical and affordable for every building type, from schools to factories to strip malls to rest area bathrooms. It's important to the consumer, but it's also important for overall economic development wherever we are trying to attract new businesses to Oregon. Next slide, please. So thank you for bearing with me through some of the details of the code adoption process. These next slides will at least be a little more colorful. In terms of key takeaways, it's important to remember that it takes two, the division and the board, to make changes to a code. We have a thorough statutory code adoption process that has been effective in continuing Oregon's leadership in building codes. I'll touch more on that later. Codes are large, complex documents and must be carefully coordinated to avoid unintended consequences. And that takes a huge brain trust of experts coming together to adopt the code and to ensure it is carried out and ultimately benefits Oregonians writ large. This board is part of that brain trust. And then codes have cascading impacts to all sorts of things like apprenticeship and licensing, training and education, projects that have already been budgeted, other agencies. Ultimately, they impact the occupants and users of buildings, which is all of us. Next slide, please. So, how do the codes impact our climate goals? The main way is through increased energy efficiency in buildings, so that where we are getting our energy from carbon producing sources, the less of it we use, the better. As you can see, if you look at this graph, we use most of our energy heating and cooling our homes. Making the building envelope tighter reduces our energy consumption by reducing the amount of air leakage. There are a number of things on this graph that the codes do not govern. Pretty much everything but heating, cooling, water heating, and lighting. I know other agencies presented to the task force about some of those other areas. This graph reflects residential energy use. In commercial buildings, the unregulated load, all the stuff outside of our code authority, is even larger. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this lest anyone ask me questions about it. And thank you to the Department of Energy for letting us use it. But basically, it's showing you where our energy comes from and where it goes. And the box, that solid red box, is around our piece, residential and commercial consumption. And then we'll kind of hone in on that on the next slide, please. So this first chart is showing energy consumption by sector, with residential and commercial consumption making up about 33%. The second graph shows what's left when you remove the parts outside of the code authority that we talked about. You're left with 23% going essentially to heating and cooling buildings and water heating. Next slide, please. So the governor has adopted 2 executive orders that include directives for building code efficiency and other climate-related improvements. EO 1720 was carefully negotiated starting back in 2016, and we are nearing the completion of its directives, which included things like requiring water sense fixture rates for water conservation, solar-ready construction for homes and businesses, and a requirement that the residential code meet a zero energy-ready home standard by October of next year, which Mark was referencing. The subsequent EO 2004, requires performance goals representing at least a 60% reduction in new building annual site consumption of energy, excluding electricity used for transportation or appliances, from 2006 levels. It also requires updates to the REACH code on a 3-year cycle. More on that later. And I think it's a good time to pause as we talk about what's next in building codes to recognize the huge gains we've made over the last several cycles, including the implementation of the directives from these executive orders. Next slide, please. So the other way that the codes are important in the climate change conversation is in the context of climate resiliency. Basically, as climate change adjusts what we need out of buildings, the codes need to change with it to help mitigate those impacts. One area where we see this is droughts. I mentioned we have water conservation standards equivalent to the EPA water sense standard. EO 1720 also asks us to look at gray water recapture, basically on-site water reuse. Another major area where we see the need for climate resiliency in the codes is in response to and anticipation of wildfires. The two main areas of concern are smoke, finding ways to make sure there's control over air intake, for example, for tenants in new apartment buildings. The other is to help resist ignition of homes from embers. We currently have a fire hardening code package available for local adoption, and it will become mandatory in the high and extreme wildfire risk areas in the wildland urban interface through the implementation of Senate Bill 762 from last year. Finally, another area of focus for climate resiliency in Oregon is for extreme weather events. The codes generally work on averages, climate zones, average temperature for sizing of equipment, but we're seeing more and more events outside of the average. And we're trying to anticipate those events, whether they be power outages or extreme heat, when we adopt the new codes. But the most urgent needs in this space, as policymakers have recognized, is really in existing buildings. I'll touch more on that later in this presentation. The impacts of climate change differ throughout the country and are changing all the time. Oregon is going to have to be nimble and adaptive, looking at the model codes through an Oregon lens to ensure we're addressing our unique needs here in Oregon. Next slide, please. So this timeline basically shows our residential code progression over the years through normalized EUI starting from 100. EUI is average energy use intensity, basically how efficient it is. Lower numbers mean less energy use, so the lower the better. Oregon has been ahead of the model code for the vast majority of this timeline, as you can see, with some points where we've briefly tied. And we intend to get back out ahead of the latest model code with the adoption of the 2023 residential code. This is like your retirement account. We invested early and often, and that has been paying dividends over the last several decades for all the folks who are in those homes. Next slide, please. This is another visualization of our efficiency effort through the years with some key lines. That part in the orange is before the development of the state building code. The first dotted line is when the state building code came into effect, and the second dotted line is our target for 2023, a zero energy ready home. A zero energy ready home is where the home energy use could be offset with the installation of on-site renewable energy such as solar. A net zero energy home, the place where the triangles meet, is one that produces all of the energy it consumes. Installation of on-site renewables, or of course, achieving renewable energy statewide, is beyond the scope of our authority in the codes. The key takeaways here are that we've made some incredible gains over the last almost 50 years, and we're hitting the limit of economically and technically feasible things we can do through the code alone. We will, of course, continue to make improvements, but barring new technology, it's going to be difficult to keep pace. Next slide, please. So we've talked a fair amount about how we adopt codes and what they apply to. These slides are to get at when the code comes into play. The codes apply to new construction, alteration, and repair. They are not retroactive, and they do not apply to existing buildings unless the building owner takes some action, like deciding to do a remodel. Energy efficiency codes apply to the maximum extent practical for alterations and repairs. And flexibility and practicality are needed here because we want to encourage voluntary upgrades, adaptive reuse, and make sure folks don't take their work underground. It also just makes sense. If you're putting in new windows, of course, you should put in windows that conform to current code standards, but you shouldn't have to tear down your walls on a remodel to build them thicker to fit in more insulation. No one would ever want to reuse or improve their building if that was the only path. Next slide, please. So why do we care when the codes apply? Because we talked about the piece of the pie we regulate. This shows what percentage of homes in Oregon we're talking about. As you can see, buildings built since 2001 represent about 15% of homes in Oregon. Almost half of the homes in Oregon, like my own, are from before any statewide building code was adopted. Of course, improvements have been made to a lot of older homes, but improving the performance of older homes is a huge piece of the puzzle and one we don't have much of a role in building codes. There's also, of course, an equity issue to consider here when we think about where we are putting our investments. Older homes, either through ownership or renting, tend to be more affordable, and therefore the impact of the increased utility costs in the older homes that comes from leaky windows and attics and inefficient equipment is felt more acutely by those residents. It is an area where there is the greatest opportunity, in my opinion, to both impact our climate goals and to help Oregonians live more comfortably and affordably in the face of more extreme weather events like last summer's heat wave. Next slide, please. So there's no limit on building above the minimum standards in the code. You may have heard Oregon's code referred to as a mini-maxi code, the floor and the ceiling, but that is referring to what can be enforced, not what a consumer or builder can choose to do. This is true for safety and efficiency. The code sets the minimum standard, but someone can certainly build a code-compliant fallout bunker or passive house, even though they are not required to. I'm going to try to stay in my lane here of BCD, but my understanding is that predictability is key for incentives. The incentive providers need to know where the code is going to be able to incentivize above code improvements when it comes to new construction. Of course, for existing buildings, as we discussed earlier, there is much more room for improvement, and they don't have to tie as directly to our code provisions. Next slide, please. So the REACH code is found in ORS 455-500, and it's an aspirational efficiency code. Builders can choose to use it. Local government has to accept it. And it's to be based on generally accepted codes and standards that achieve greater energy efficiency than the state building code. There is both a residential and commercial REACH code, each reaching from its respective base code. The commercial REACH code you will find later on your agenda today. Next slide, please. So we currently have a residential REACH code, and as I said, the commercial code's on your agenda. I was asked by the task force to provide some data on above code building, and we don't have data, even on the use of the REACH code. Building plans are checked against the adopted codes, and as I said, there's no limit on building above code, but because it is not the minimum standard, it is not tracked through the plan review and inspection process. Next slide, please. Well, I'm pretty biased here. This is my favorite part of the presentation, and I will cite some sources to support it, but Oregon has long been a national leader in energy efficiency building codes in this country, and we intend for that leadership to continue. As I mentioned, we had the first state energy code in the country, and more recently, we were the first in the country to adopt ASHRAE 90.1 2019, which is the most efficient commercial code available. Oregon experts at BCD, but also across the private and nonprofit sector, are national thought leaders on energy efficiency policy. I've mentioned a few Oregon ideas that have been incorporated into the model codes, and our staff sit on national code-making committees to help track and influence policy at the national level. Next slide, please. So this first map is from the US Department of Energy and shows where states are in commercial energy based on what ASHRAE edition they are equivalent to. As I mentioned earlier, we're on a path of early adoption with minimal amendments. So we were the first state in the country on 90.1 2019. Again, this code covers everything not covered in the residential code, from offices to multifamily housing, schools, restaurants. Next slide, please. So this map, also from the US Department of Energy, shows the residential side comparing to versions of the IECC. While Oregon is indeed in the green, this is really where that long view I mentioned is important. I'm confident we will be back in the dark green with the adoption of the 2023 code. It's also a good check on our progress relative to the rest of the country, much of which is more than 10 years behind us. I'm also not sure any state can stack up to the high levels of training and compliance we have here, which means we do more than just adopt the codes. We actually carry them out and get those real world savings for consumers. Next slide, please. So this slide is from the American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy, or ACEEE. You can see their methodology on the right, which includes factors outside building codes. It highlights the importance of those other factors in the built environment's climate impact, like appliance standards and utilities. It also notes state-led initiatives like the governor's EOs and like this group, bringing together the expertise to work on these important issues. Oregon has been in the top 10 of the ACEEE rankings since they started the scorecards back in 2006, and that shows the continual leadership and effective code adoption I was referring to. Next slide, please. So I think the key takeaways on the code comparisons are that we are proud of Oregon's leadership. We're committed to continual predictable improvement to maintain our top 10 or arguably higher performance nationally. We're always learning from the successes and maybe some of the missteps as well from other states, which is enhanced by our engagement on those national code-making bodies. And it's particularly helpful to look at other states on the cutting edge of similar challenges to Oregon, like looking to other wildfire-prone states for fire hardening and wildfire smoke mitigation successes. Next slide, please. So overall, looking forward, we intend to continue to improve efficiency in the code while adhering to our principles of code adoption, making the code flexible and usable for our customers, and balancing our progress against our affordable housing needs. We're reaping the benefits of the work done in the preceding decades, and it is going to be challenging to find more technically and economically feasible improvements for new construction, but we are up for the challenge. The building code is only one tool in the tool belt, but both our climate change mitigation and our climate resiliency needs are going to require a coordinated enterprise approach to address the impacts of the built environment on climate change and the impacts of climate change on the built environment. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And Jay, I don't know if you wanted to give this group kind of an update on the task force work, since that first meeting there.
I'm happy to.
Great.
So Jay Hansen through the chair. Alana, thank you very much for that. I've sat through so many hours of mind-numbing presentations from various state agencies. I think Blake, you sit on it too, don't you? Yeah. It's
just as not on the task force, but we've supported with presentations.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it looks. I think I've seen your face on the screen.
That's right. Yep.
And Oregon Energy Trust, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, on and on and on. Everybody has a position on climate change and energy efficiency. And I have to say that, Alana, the presentation that you made for BCD is the most informative, reasonable one. And I did make a little bit of a note. I think it's like slide 11 or maybe it's slide 12. The slide that shows how code can impact climate change. I'd like to get a copy of that slide. It was down there lower, 10, 9, 7, something like that. But anyway, I'd like to use that. We have been promised, this task force the commitment has been made by the legislative leadership in this task force that the activities of this task force are not to mandate fossil fuels, the elimination of fossil fuels. And also, it is not a threat to or trying to break the statewide code, building code, not to break that model. And that is what's most important to me, that we retain a statewide building code. However, what I have seen, what I have been witness to, sure seems to be a lot of agendas that are going and pointing towards both of those activities. The negotiations for the formation of the task force specifically said no to both of those. That's not the intent of both of those things, but the actual activities, the actual presentations, the actual statements, it's a pretty politicized, divided task force, and it's pretty there's a line in the sand. That's my opinion. Okay, so there's judgment around that. That's me. Take that for what it's worth. A point was made that really bothered me. Somebody spoke up because I had made the point that Oregon and Maryland are the only two remaining states that have a single statewide building code. And there was a retort of sorts by an individual saying, well, why shouldn't we be like the others that have multiple building codes? And so there's a lack of understanding of the value of a statewide building code or the chaos that comes without having a statewide building code. There's also comments that have been made that the statewide building code should not be applied to various climatic areas of the state of Oregon. And so there's a lack of understanding that the building code itself accommodates different climatic conditions. If our freezing temperatures are colder, we have to bury our water deeper. If it's warmer, we can get showers. There's accommodation in the code for various climatic conditions. And it's not that the code is so narrow that it has to be applied statewide, irregardless of climatic conditions. So that being said, there's some education that needs to happen, and the format is not the best to just jump in and provide clarification. You can't have a open dialogue, active open dialogue in this environment, this Zoom environment. It's pretty difficult. You raise your hand, you wait, you get distracted by, I raise my hand, I wait, I get distracted by 6 or 7 other things that are said, and I can't even remember why I raised my hand. So it's, for me, it's very difficult. There is a mechanism. If anybody wants to chime in, offer an opinion, a thought, there is a mechanism. They call it the jam board, I believe. And it is a post-it board for concepts and ideas that you submit via email. And I'm going to be about a half hour down.
Okay,
So
I'll be back after I'm leaving.
apologize for that. If anybody has a thought or a comment, you could send it to myself. And if it makes it through my filter, which is a serious filter, I'm happy to contribute to the jam board. And it's a collection point for concepts and ideas. And it's like a additional person. It's like your 6th man off the bench. They reference every individual plus the jam board when they're putting together these concepts. Again, this task force is for creating recommendations for the legislature to act on to promote resilient climate. And again, I will offer myself as your conduit with a filter to the task force, if you wish. And everything's on the table. We had public comment. We had quite a few public comments at the last meeting. I think it was Tuesday. I think it was last Tuesday, maybe a week ago Tuesday. The meetings are from 3 to 5. And they can just get really mind numbing. And they happen about every other week. So there's been quite a frequency of these meetings, but there was public comment. There were quite a few individuals that jumped on and made their little minute or minute and a half spiel about just stopping fossil fuels right now, 100%, no option. This is what we must do. So we get that. That's the kind of thing that is we're dealing with. Did anybody want to ask me any questions about how numb my mind is getting? It's important effort. It's very important effort. It's going to have a big impact on our industry.
Gary Heikkinen from the Building Code Structures Board has his hand raised.
Gary.
Thanks very much, Jay. And I did not have a question for you, but I just want to thank Alana and Mark and the rest of those in the division for their continued focus on advancing energy efficiency while keeping all these other practical, cost-effective, resilient issues in mind. I've been involved in other states, other venues where there has been, I think, too much political agenda involved, and where the process, I think, has dismissed and ignored some of these practical issues, especially issues like cost and housing and costs of operation. So again, I really appreciate Alana, Mark, others at the division for your continued good work. Kudos. from me, and just keep it up and just keep it up. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gary. And through the chair, just to Jay's point about there are only 2 states with statewide mini maxi codes. Scott Linfesti also sits, some of you may remember him, he used to work at Building Codes and he's a building official now, and he represents building officials on the task force. And he said, and I've been thinking about this, I think it's true, that it's not that other states have had statewide building codes and then decided they didn't work out. It's that they've never gotten there, that they didn't start from that place, that they had whatever code system they had. And I think, we're coming up on the 50-year anniversary of the statewide building code. We're going to be making a push here at the division to kind of take a step back and tell our story, because we're at this kind of transformative time in Oregon. We're going to have all these new decision makers. We're going to have a new governor, and we're going to have a whole lot of new people in the legislature. And so that's why I think this task force is important, because it's going to be introducing these ideas to folks that may not have thought about the building code at all before, or, what impacts housing prices. Some people are going to be thinking about these things for the first time. So I think it's important that we can kind of introduce our successes to folks and help them understand, those things that I was trying to highlight, the coordination between the codes, the handoffs, how it ties in with training and licensing and those other pieces. Why it's so successful. And, I'm not sure that they did a lot of things back in the 70s in Oregon that have stood the test of time and were big, kind of, required a lot of forethought. I'm not sure whether you would pass a lot of those things today. You know what I mean? And so the political environment has changed, but I don't think that means that the fact that other places haven't adopted those structures means that they aren't successful. So anyway.
Correct. Well, what I'm made very aware of by my time on this task force is that decarbonization is a real political hot button term that has polarized our population. And if you're going to get elected in Oregon and maintain your job in Oregon as an elected official, you better be pushing and speaking to those people who are very motivated by decarbonizing and carbon zero, net zero. All that stuff is just very politicized and very, very polarizing. That's my fear. We got a whole bunch of new elected officials coming in. They want to keep their job. Their base is really focused on decarbonizing. Anyway, back to the chair. Thank you, Tom.
Eli
Thank you, Jay.
Walliam has his hand raised from the Residential Manufactured Structures Board.
Okay, Eli?
Yeah, thank you, Eli Volum, Residential Manufactured Structures Board. So I want to say thank you, Alana. I thought that was a great presentation, and I appreciate this discussion after the fact too. I think you hit on some really good points that in the presentation that address some of the stuff Jay's talking about the politicization of a lot of these issues. And that is, let's focus on the cost and the performance. Like, what are the real costs? What are the real savings? And let's keep an eye on, new construction was a pretty small piece of the overall pie for savings. So what's the impact as well? So there certainly are opportunities, and there are smart things we can do. So as long as we're bringing facts, looking at real information, real performance, seeing how much we're really moving the needle, I think we're on the right track. The last element too was, providing a roadmap, and that's the opportunity here with the REACH codes is we can put things out there that people can try, or we can model, or we can look at from a bunch of different ways of identifying where we're going. And then I'll just close with saying, my work at Eugene Water and Electric Board, we've really, like a lot of organizations, have been embracing continuous improvement and trying to incorporate that into our culture. And one of the tools that we use is plan, do, check, act. So you plan something out using good information, facts, and real data. You implement it. and then you check it. You do the evaluation. Are you getting the performance that you're expecting? And then you adjust and as necessary. So I think just back to that presentation, it did a good summary of what can be accomplished with building codes and how it works. And I think as long as we're bringing good data and good facts, which she said, a lot of smart people are bringing stuff that brings, paints very different pictures. And I've seen that over the last 4 years. You have really smart, intelligent, professional folks, and we still see a lot of agenda pushing with the numbers they're bringing. So it just comes back to let's get good data, let's get costs, let's try to agree on that as a basis, and then we can help figure out what kind of actual impacts we can have. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jay, for your efforts and work. I appreciate that. I guess along with the agenda that people are pushing to be all electric, I guess the cost that isn't on residential now is demand fees. And I'm not sure whether if you start putting in flow through electric water heaters, that if the power companies aren't going to start inserting demand fees onto the top of that, and I'm sure that cost isn't involved at this point.
Mr. Acting Chair, Jay Hansen from the Mechanical Board has his hand raised.
Jay?
Yeah, I do have my hand raised, and it'll probably go up 7 or 8 more times. Once I get going, I apologize, but I get going. But Eli, you're 100% correct, and I heard the word real around data quite a few times in what you said, and that's a struggle because anybody with an agenda is going to present their data, and data's data. Real is the issue. I had a conversation with Mark Long a week ago or so. He had an interesting comment about using our existing structure and the REACH code as an avenue to promote alternative construction standards, methods, means. And if we maybe develop the REACH code out, so we had various different tiers or REACH code options or REACH code choices, in effect, a palette of a menu of choices, then that incentivizes builders and owners to take those particular paths. All those individual items would have been vetted through, proved, meet the minimums, the safeties, and the standards. And then you could tie together the myriad funding sources that are available out there. Just about every division, every department has at least one type of subsidy for energy efficiency. There's too many out there to really know everything that's available. And if we could funnel all those dollars through building codes, and if somebody applies for, constructs, and has permitted, then constructs, then has it inspected, then they would get their subsidy. And this mechanism could all flow through our statewide building code with many different options on the REACH that could be taken. And he also mentioned to me that the Oregon Energy Trust, he's seen some numbers, and I would like some data. And I wonder if Alana could possibly, or staff could possibly verify this for me. But I'd like to see what the real percentage is of dollars that the Energy Trust gets versus dollars that make it to projects. Because I think it's like 40% of the dollars that flow into the Energy Trust actually pay out into subsidies for projects. 60% goes towards administration or whatever else it goes to, study. But what I'd like to know what that is. I think there's a huge chunk there that there's some efficiencies that we could go after, and possibly those efficiencies could be maximized through this kind of very rough draft model that Mark Long exposed to me. I mean, does any of this get some energies flowing, Alana, or anybody else on the horn with staff about trying to manage funds through a REACH code application inspection process?
Well, Jay,
in paying out?
I'm gonna be careful here and hedge on you because of earlier. I don't want to speak to other agencies, and I will say we're disciplined about our kind of scope here at BCD. I would worry about anything that kind of takes us away from what we're good at. But I will say I know that Mark Heiser met with Energy Trust with some other folks, and there was some discussion about better coordination between the REACH code and their incentive programs at Energy Trust under our current metrics. I think what you're talking about would be a bill, then we'll see how my future boss feels about that bill, all that kind of stuff. But under the laws we have them today, certainly I think we can do better working with Energy Trust to align incentives and use that REACH code as a better tool. Because you're right, it is a very flexible tool. And I think it's kind of in its infancy, and we can go a lot of different directions in making it more effective for folks.
Okay. John, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I'll put that down before I forget about it. Hi, yeah, so I'm here as a representative of Energy Trust of Oregon's EPS New Construction Program. And I'm just going to drop into the chat first of all. This is a data set that we publish every year. This is the homes that came through our EPS New Construction Program since 2015. And so it shows all the measures that the builders have chosen to install and have determined for their own part, make sense for them. We don't prescribe what builders should do to earn incentives. We provide a sliding scale of incentives from 10% up to 40% improvement over the base code modeled in either REM-rate or Ecotrope. And so that's what the source of this data is. And we've got a pretty comprehensive overview sheet on the first tab of that data set if you go to the website. So just first of all, if you want to know what folks are doing to exceed code, then that's a great spot to go. Just secondly, we just in terms of how Energy Trust money gets spent, ultimately Energy Trust of Oregon is a public utility, is overseen by the Public Utility Commission and has stringent cost effectiveness requirements that must meet at the measure level and the program level. And so there's extensive documentation every year on how that money gets spent and how it's accounted for. And so, Jay, if you wanted to dig into that, then there's certainly lots of records to unpack. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other hands raised, so we'll move on to agenda item 5, which is appeals. There doesn't appear to be any. And then 6 is unfinished business, and there's none on the schedule. So we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is adopting the REACH code. And Andy, is that you?
That's me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Andy Bolton, Senior Policy Advisor with the division. ORS 455-500 requires that the division, in consultation with the SEEB, adopt a REACH code separate from the state building code. The 2022 Oregon Commercial REACH Code, or the OCRC, is a set of aspirational aspirational energy standards for buildings governed by the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, or the OSSC. The OCRC must be more efficient than the energy provisions in the OSSC, must be technically feasible. The OCRC is not mandatory, but must be accepted by all jurisdictions administering the state building code. The division started the process of developing the 2022 OCRC in January by soliciting public input and proposals for what should be included. The proposal period was open from January 10th, 2022 to February 27th, 2022. After the proposal period closed, the division developed a draft version of the 2022 OCRC through outreach and dialogue between division staff and stakeholders, including a review of proposals at the Oregon Energy Code Stakeholder Panel meeting on March 15th, 2022. On May 25th, 2022, the division held a public meeting to hear comments and questions regarding its proposed 2022 OCRC. The input gathered from that meeting was used to further refine the division's proposed 2022 OCRC. All of that has led to the proposed 2022 OCRC that is in your packet today. The division welcomes any input and recommendations that the board may have on the proposed 2022 OCRC. We have Mike Heiser, we have Mark Heiser on the Zoom as well if there are any technical questions about the contents of the proposed commercial reach code. Ultimately, this item will require a motion.
Okay. Mark, do you have any comments?
Thank you, Chair Kyle. Mark Heiser with the division. Once again, just wanted to point to there were 3 different proposals that came in. One was really a group of pieces that would need to be put together and looked at. The second proposal was to try and find a way to cut out sort of the energy provisions of the standard 189/US International Green Building Construction Code. And a third was going with what is currently the Massachusetts stretch code model, which was really using the energy modeling paths in the code to sort of see what you would do to get 10% better than code. We're sort of on a limited time here, it's been a shorter code cycle this time, and the division went with the third option, which was, of course, going along with what Massachusetts has done. We modified the proposal slightly to make sure, if you, in your packet, I'm going to bring up mine again, is a version fairly short and simple. You're either using the energy cost budget method to get 10% better, using the Appendix G version, which sort of aligns with what people use when they're doing a LEED building. It's primarily related to the regulated loads on the building. And of course, since Oregon has a requirement in our version of 90.1 for data centers to use standard 90.4, we have a method to cover buildings. We use relatively the same scope for the building sizes and types that are done in the Massachusetts code. That was what was in the proposal. We did tighten up and threw in a little bit wider scope or earlier trigger for different mercantile types that are available. That would include larger, more commercial type retail operations a little bit sooner, because there was a proposal to add the reference to the We Stand, which was also approved by this group, to be in the residential reach code. That's just thrown in as well on this to align the 2 reach codes. If there are any questions from the group, I'd be happy to answer them at this time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I guess I don't see any hands raised. I guess my question, this is for over 40,000 square feet. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chair Kyle. Mark Heiser with the division. So for some high energy use occupancies, laboratories, data centers, conditioned warehouses, and then retail or mercantile, the trigger is above 40,000 square feet, serving a single tenant area. Then all other new buildings, it would be if you were over 100,000 square feet of conditioned area. And there's an exception for R2, R3, and R4 occupancy buildings, 5 stories and fewer. So you really hit that at sort of a high-rise residential occupancy.
Okay. Gary, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. I would just say, although I think it would have been nice to have some prescriptive path rather than kind of performance path, which is in there now. I do realize the complexity that would have introduced to the REACH code, since we're not just talking about one building type, we're talking about multiple building types. I do appreciate the simplicity of this. Comply with 90.1 and do 10% better. And I think it's a good first step and a relatively simple first step. I'm certainly supportive of this action to move forward on this proposed REACH code. So thanks again, Mark, for all your work.
Anyone else? I guess we'll entertain a motion.
I'd like to jump in with a comment, Tom, if that's okay.
Okay.
Eli Volin through the chair. So, yeah, I echo Gary's sentiments. I think it's a reasonable approach, performance-based savings, using the existing tools. And I guess I would just put out there that I hope that we can capture any projects that opt to pursue this REACH code, so we can understand what's contributing to how they're getting savings. And I think this REACH code will play nicely with above code utility programs that, they can create custom projects and custom incentives. Hopefully we could do that here at the utility I work for. So I guess I just put a call out there that hopefully we can put something in place where we can track any projects that may seek to follow this code. And that will likely be any projects that are already doing something, above code programs for incentives or green certifications or whatnot. I'd be surprised if any projects seek REACH code just to do REACH code. But so that's just to ask is the Building Codes Division is I hope that we can figure out a way to track these projects. Thank you.
Okay. I guess we're at the point where we need to have a motion made.
Walt Caudle here, move to approve.
Jay Hansen here. I'll second that motion.
Okay, I guess the motion's been made and seconded. Let me read what the recommendation is. Motion recommend approval of the proposed 2022 OCRC with the understanding that the OCRC is available as an above code option for builders and consumers that is not mandatory. Okay, you agree to that wording?
I'll second that.
All right. All right, Debbie, would you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Gary Heikkinen from the BCSB board.
Aye.
Ryan Richards, the electrical and elevator.
Aye.
Blake Schlide from the Department of Energy.
Yes.
Walter Caudle, from the mechanical board.
Aye.
John Camiller from the residential manufactured structures board.
Aye.
Eli Volume from the residential manufactured structures board.
Aye.
Travis Argue from the state plumbing board.
Aye.
And Jay Hansen from the mechanical board.
Yay.
And acting as chair, Thomas Kyle from the electrical and elevator board.
Aye.
Mr. Acting Chair, the motion passes unanimously.
Okay, thank you all. The next time, we don't have any announcements, I can tell. And we move to adjournment unless anybody has any comments. Okay, there being no further business, this hybrid meeting of the Construction Industrial Energy Board is adjourned at 10:39 a.m. Thank you all.
Well done, Tom. Thank you.
Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.